Thank you very much, Mr. Betts. And it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and Happy New Year to you and everybody else who's here this morning. This is a 90-minute debate, and I've said to quite a number of people that I could easily speak for at least 90 minutes on this topic. Now, it'll be a relief to all of you that I'm not going to do that. But the reason is it's a source of huge frustration in my constituency. Owning a new home, the development of new homes should be a source of great joy. But actually, too often, it's a source of great distress. And there are a few reasons for that I want to talk about. But before I go into those, I do want to say at the outset that, contrary to some of the media stereotypes about an area like mine, most people in my constituency aren't opposed to new homes. If they're homeowners themselves, they entirely understand why other people want to own a home. They often have children and grandchildren that they're trying to help get on the housing ladder. They know we need housing for key workers. They know that sometimes people just want to move into one of these new homes from where they already live in the constituency. But it's the way that these things are developing and the way in which they're causing problems in the local area that people have real frustration with. Now, the first issue is simply the quality of a lot of the homes that goes up, because it's often poor. Sometimes it's very good, but too often it's poor, with major defects that constituents are having that are taking years. I've got constituents who've spent 2, 3, 4 years trying to get, sometimes more, trying to get these defects repaired. And this is not like buying a cheap version of something on eBay and, half expecting there might be something wrong with it. This is the biggest purchase any of us will make, and you do not expect to then have years of trying to sort out the problems with it. And unfortunately, the process by which constituents are trying to do this, they feel completely outmatched by the builder who built it. Sometimes they'll blame the contractor. Sometimes they'll say there's nothing wrong. We signed it off according to building regulations. But I've been in some of these places. You can see these huge issues, and it's completely unacceptable that people are experiencing these. The second issue is about the impact of these homes on the environment. Now, that has two major aspects to it. One is what it does to the local environment around that area. So, quite naturally, people can see greenfield sites disappearing. They know that often, I had one constituent write to me who said that, the biodiversity commitments that this particular house builder made have not been kept whatsoever. It has an impact on air quality, it has an impact on water quality, but it's also how the homes are built themselves. I am continually asked by constituents, why are we building so many homes we know we've got to retrofit in a few years? And there's not an easy answer to that. I'm continually asked, why can't every new home have solar panels? Why can't every new home have heat pumps? Now, I understand why. There are various reasons why you may not put the same thing in every kind of house. I completely welcome the government's commitment on having electric charging points in every new home. I really, really welcome the future home standard that will make new homes from 2025 net zero ready with a 75% reduction in their emissions. But the point still stands that thousands of homes are going up right now, and we know, because of the ambitious net zero goals we have, we're going to have to retrofit a lot of how they're being built. And the reason is because it's cheaper for the house builders to build them in that way today. The third aspect is about affordability. Now, I've said a few times in this place, no one who rents has ever said to me there are too many new homes going on. They only say they're not affordable. They say they've saved for years and years, and it doesn't matter how often they save, they don't get close enough to being able to afford one. Now, the average house price in my constituency is $335,000. To London ears, that might sound fine, but it's 9.2 times median income. It's out of the reach of most people. An affordability threshold, which is 80% of that, still isn't affordable. And again, we run into bad practices here because we all know that what happens is these developments have a certain number of affordable homes committed to, and this is driven down time after time after time after time on the grounds that the development wouldn't be viable to maintain that promise. And broken promises are a constant theme in this area, that the development wouldn't be viable if you kept to that number of affordable homes. Everybody knows their role in that game. I will give way.
Speech and a particularly important point on affordable housing. What I'm often told is that the developers, when they make these arguments about viability, are working on a 20% profit margin per property. Does he agree with me that is completely unsustainable?
David Johnson.
I think the Honourable Member makes a very important point. The point I was just about to make is that when the taxpayer is subsidising the development of affordable homes, and when the profits of our large house builders are so large, actually often bordering 30%, come rain or shine, because they're making these profits in all weathers at the moment, it's completely unacceptable for them to play this game time after time so that people are unable to get on the housing ladder. The fourth aspect I wanted to talk about is the role of management companies, because actually with the purchase of the home, the costs for the people in these new homes often don't stop. They're often signed up to really quite expensive contracts with management companies who purport to provide services to maintain communal areas. And it's often very, very difficult for the people in these homes to find out what all is being done for this money. They see the charge go up year after year, but they see that their communal area isn't being maintained. They're told there are staff that are employed to do things. They never see these staff. They work hard to try and get some transparency as to what is being provided for this money, and they can't get it. They can get a basic summary, that's about it. And these are often very qualified people trying to get this information, and they can't do so. And I have a particular management company at the moment where the residents don't want me to name them, and I won't yet, but where the residents are, they're often elderly, they're often sick, they're often vulnerable, and they feel completely bullied and exploited by their management company. And right now they're being pressured into taking a new lease, which they don't want to take because they know it's going to be bad for them, but they fear the repercussions if they don't. And they also fear the repercussions if they go to someone to talk about it. I mean, they've done so with me, but as you can hear, they don't want me to talk about who they are. This is an appalling situation for people to be in. And far too often, there is a real problem with the way in which these management companies are fleecing the people in these new homes when they've already spent as much money as they have. And then the fifth aspect I wanted to yes, we'll give way.
Bring this forward. And one of the things that prior to preparation for this debate and looking into the matter was leasehold in the United Kingdom and UK and England and Wales and Scotland. People are unable to buy their leasehold, but in Northern Ireland, it's one part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain that you can. Does the Honourable Gentleman feel that when it comes to purchase of freehold, instead of making it a freehold, which is what happens in England, Wales and Scotland, and Northern Ireland have a chance to buy it out, does he feel that perhaps that should be something that should happen here in the mainland as well?
I thank the Honourable Member for that point, and I completely agree with him, and I expect the Minister will address that point when he talks about it, because I agree, most people think they're then owning that home, and in fact they can end up too often feeling just like tenants with costs. I mean, I had this myself until quite recently. I used to get a bill for £300 on Christmas Day every year. It was billed 25th of December, £300 for absolutely nothing, precisely because I was in that situation. But, you know, constituents of mine are in a much worse scenario. The fifth aspect I wanted to talk about, though, is the overall sort of broken process, broken system that this operates in. Now, I don't blame government entirely for all of this. I think councils have some responsibilities here when they they don't enforce their planning conditions, if they go above the assessed numbers that they're supposed to be building, when they allow the same application over and over again when they could refuse it after 2 times. They don't take a bigger picture view. So I've got villages like Sutton Courtenay in my constituency which feel hugely overdeveloped because what's happening is the individual applications are all being approved and nobody is looking at what's happening to the whole area and why it might not be a good idea to keep approving those. And ultimately, I think these companies have to be held accountable for their behaviour, for the fact that they will apply to sites that they know are not in the local plan for them to apply to, as is happening in Grove in my constituency at the moment. They will continually try and build on floodplains. They continually fail to adhere to their Section 106 and SIL agreements, sometimes not building the infrastructure at all, sometimes building pointless community things like a pathway that only goes halfway across the estate, or a bike path that leads to nowhere, just so they can say that they've done it. And you have all this sort of thing going on with the new developments in my constituency. So I don't blame government for it all, but I do think it's government's job to try and make sure the system doesn't operate in this way. If you had to sum up a lot of the problems in my constituency, it would be too many homes, too little infrastructure, because the 2 district councils that I cover, relative to their size, are in the top 10 areas for house building in the country. Yet they're both in the bottom third for infrastructure spending. And this is a huge bugbear, because to put this in sort of numerical context, when an estimate was done of what the population changes were going to be between 2017 and 2027, the largest town and surrounding area in my constituency, Didcot, is going to go from 36,000 to 51,000. The second largest area, Wantage and Grove, is going to go from 17,000 to 27,000. This is in a 10-year period. Farringdon's getting thousands more. Wallingford's getting thousands more. And the infrastructure isn't following with this. So it's harder to get a GP appointment. Your roads the roads in the constituency get more and more congested. It's harder to get a school place. There's one village with 220 child school, and they've built 300 houses right next to it. And so the catchment area just last year became less than 470 metres, and all the people who've lived there for a long time, who expected their child to go to that school, now can't get into that school. So when my constituents hear that planning reform may mean new houses and they won't be able to oppose them, or the Oxford-Cambridge Arc may mean more houses, or the Oxfordshire 2050 plan that council leaders to may lead to more houses, they're not concerned out of NIMBYism. They're concerned out of the experience that they've had over many, many years of so many houses going in and so many promises being broken. And to conclude, I just want to talk about a few things that I think should happen. There are lots of things, and there are plenty of experts in this room who I know will talk about other aspects to this. But the first is we need a much tougher regime for the quality of these buildings in the first place. Now, I know that the forthcoming Ombudsman will deal with some of these issues. But as I say, it's completely unacceptable to pay that much money and have that many problems. And we need very tight conditions on the quality. This threshold needs to be raised, and if it's not met, fixed within a certain time frame, not go on for years, and there to be penalties if it's not done within that period. The second is, I think we do need use it or lose it planning permissions. Now, I know there are debates about how best you do this, but I'm frequently written to about the 1 million permissions that haven't been built on. I know there's a debate about land banking, whether it happens or not. You'd be hard-pressed to persuade me that it doesn't happen, at least from the developer's point of view. And I do think people should, if they aren't, but we're familiar in this place with the phrase dig a trench, because the emphasis has been on starting the building, i.e. companies then dig a trench to suggest that they've done so, and the houses then take years and years to appear. Actually, we need these completed within a certain period, and again, there might be taxes levied or fines paid if they're not, but I think the permission should be lost entirely if they're not. The third is about the environmental standards. Now, again, I think here, if it's going on for several years without these houses being built, they should be built to what the latest environmental standard is, not the one at the time they got permission. Because, again, that's what's happening at the moment. We're building houses, we're not building houses, these companies are building houses to an environmental standard of several years ago, when they should actually be building to a standard of the future. So, again, I think this needs to be something that is changed. We've got to make developers and house builders commit to their affordability criteria. Our big house builders are doing completely fine for profits, for their own viability, so they cannot keep saying the development wouldn't be viable to commit to what they originally promised. When it comes to management companies, I think, again, we need a much stricter regime here. It's very murky. They are getting away with appalling practices. They're bullying their residents into things. They're they are fleecing them year after year for things they're not providing. So we need a tougher regime for them where they can't keep hiking these charges without an extraordinary set of circumstances. Often these charges are going up because of things this company itself has done and got wrong, and then it's passing the charge on to residents when they had no say in the first place. Much more transparency and penalties for bad behaviour in this way. And then a couple of more things before I finish. First is about I understand that house builders want a level playing field. They don't want to have to commit to, an individual company doesn't want to commit to things which are very expensive if its rivals aren't doing so. And that's where I think the role for government to raise the standards so they've all got to do it is correct. But I also want a more level playing field for smaller building companies like Greencore in my constituency, because these are often much more environmentally friendly, much more efficient, produce higher quality homes, but they're outbid all the time by the financial muscle of the big boys. So perhaps we need to reserve more sites for these as a proportion of the sites that develop. Perhaps we need to give them greater access to capital. But I am all in favour of the smaller organisation rather than the larger one. I ran small charities, not larger ones. I think we can get a better product from smaller house builders. We need to help more of them into the market. And then the final point is this issue of infrastructure. We need it to go in first. It is not right to pile more and more houses, more and more people into an area and do nothing for supporting the services and infrastructure in that area. I've been campaigning to get Grove Station reopened, to get improvements on our roads, to get better medical facilities, because now we have GP surgeries bursting at the seams. You heard those numbers of the thousands more people being added to the area. And we don't have GP surgeries that come along with it, or the number of school places that we need to come along with it. So we need this infrastructure to go in first, because unfortunately, when my constituents are told, well, it will come, they've heard that too many times. They've heard that over decades. The infrastructure is going to come with the houses. It never has. And now they don't believe it. And so we've got to start getting that in first. And as part of that, we might better capture the land value increase that happens when planning permission comes, which all goes to the owner at the moment. Some of that ought to go to the local community. They're the ones who will live with the new houses, not the landowner who's sold the land at the end. In sum, I think the balance of power is wrong. I think the management companies, house builders, developers, they have too much, and local residents have too little. And the government can't be blamed for every single thing a private company does, but it can help to restore the balance so that the local community don't see new houses as a curse on the area they used to love.
Right. Now, the question is that the House has considered the role of developers, house builders and management companies in new homes. We've got 8 colleagues who want to speak in the debate. I want to start the wind-up just before 22, so that gives us just under an hour. People can work that out. That's about 6 or 7 minutes per person. I won't put a formal guideline on, but just move on that basis that people will comply with that. Justin Madison.
Thank you, Mr. Betts. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair, and a happy new year to you and all here today. And can I congratulate the honourable member for Wantage for securing this debate and for the very useful introduction and interesting points that he's made. This is the first debate of 2022, and it may be a new year, but as we've heard, many of the issues that we are debating are not new, and I think, aside from the leasehold scandal, actually, they've had insufficient attention from this place. And we need to start by saying we absolutely need more places for people to live. I doubt there will be a member in this place who disagrees with that, and whilst there are some general targets set by government about how many homes should be built, the detail is rightly left to, in the main, local councils. But the reality is that they and the communities they represent have actually a very limited say about what sort of homes are built and where they're built, and actually, as the honourable member for Wantage mentioned, how the infrastructure that goes with it is delivered. And that is another of the problem, because we're often told that the wrong types of home are built in the wrong places, and that can be argued ad infinitum, and it often is. But the bottom line is that in terms of achieving enough decent affordable housing, we are continually falling short. Decent housing is critical to the national infrastructure. This is the bedrock of people's lives. It's too often left to the market to resolve, but the market is clearly failing. And when developers start building, all too often in my experience, they show their contempt for local communities by riding roughshod over all the development conditions imposed on them, by working longer hours, making more noise, building higher than they should and closer than they should to existing properties, creating more work for the beleaguered planning department, putting more demands on councils who, after a decade of austerity, simply do not have the powers and resources to keep up. And of course, quite often by the time the council have managed to catch up with the complaint, the house is already built, the drains have been put in. It is a massive financial, logistical and legal battle to get developers to stick to plans when they've gotten that far down the road, and many councils simply don't have the capacity to get into those kind of fights, especially if we're talking actually just about a couple of metres, because that won't actually much look on a plan. But actually, if you live next door to it, a couple of metres makes a huge difference. And what about bringing roads up to an acceptable standard so they can be adopted by the local authority? People are waiting years for roads to be adopted, but I don't blame, again, the local authority. They have set out what is needed to be done, and again, they don't have the resources all the time to be continually chasing developers who sold the homes but have moved on. Where is the incentive for the developers to come back and actually finish the job that they've started? And I also want to say a few words about the massive expansion of estate management companies. And it seems that the idea of the developer paying the local authority a commuted sum to cut the grass and maintain common parts has had its day. This reduces developers' costs, although it doesn't seem to lead to cheaper house prices. And of course, it costs the homeowner far more in the long run, as they're in effect paying twice for maintenance of open spaces, once through a management fee and once through their council tax. Once again, though, it's the council that gets lumbered with all the grief and blame, with developers looking to replace their lost funding streams with what will hopefully be the end of leasehold. I am concerned, and I've said this more than once recently, that estate management companies will become the new PPI of the house building industry. There is little regulation, little transparency, and if we're really honest, little need for estate management companies in most settings. So why do we have them at all? House builders build houses. That is their core business. They aren't really interested in managing estates. Indeed, they can't wait to get rid of them onto some company who may specialise in these things. For developers, creating an estate management company is nothing more than a calculation on the balance sheet. They have zero interest in keeping the verges neat and tidy after they've gone. But if they can make the bottom line look more attractive by getting a management company in, they will. And they keep getting away with it because we let them. Why can't we just start from the basic principle that the local councils should be doing these jobs and estate management companies are an unnecessary tax on homeowners? And how many people are told what the implications are of an estate management company or how much it costs? What developers say to new buyers in the showroom and what is in the final contract, they're often very different. But by the time the paperwork arrives, it's too late. People may have already spent thousands on that move, never mind the psychological commitment they've already made. And of course, there are those things that are said in the showroom that actually don't appear in any documentation at all. And a classic example of that is in my constituency, where my constituents now look out on a 30-foot high warehouse, which the developers conveniently forgot to mention already had planning permission when they sold them their home. They're still waiting for the KFC they were told was going to be there, actually. And of course, because this is just sales patch, there is no legal accountability for the lies that are told. This is the biggest single purchase people will ever make. There really needs to be far greater accountability for what developers say and for what they build. But at the moment, they seem to have a free pass. These developers, household names working across the country, move on from one project to the next, leaving behind on some occasions problems that can take years to resolve. There is another development in my constituency that has ended up in court with one group of residents pitted against another, and with maintenance bills racking up in their thousands because the developers didn't do the paperwork or the job properly in the first place. I know they're causing havoc elsewhere because other members have told me about it. But what can a council do? They have no grounds to refuse planning permission on the basis they've been a poor performer elsewhere. What about a fit and proper person test for the directors of these companies? So, in conclusion, Mr Betts, I'd like to see much greater political direction and oversight on the house building industry. They are, after all, the people who are going to build the homes we need. At the moment, quite understandably, they organise their affairs to maximise their profits. Housing, though, is a critical part of our infrastructure. A roof over your head is a fundamental, and it has been shown time and again that we can't rely on the market to just deliver that. So, after 4.5 years from Grenfell, when we still don't really have a decision on who is liable for the defects that have been created there, it's very clear that there is a reluctance, I think, in government to actually grasp the nettle and take some ownership of this industry.
Teresa Villiers.
Thank you, Mr. Betts. I start by declaring interest as the owner of an investment property held on a long leasehold basis. I want to congratulate the Honourable Member for Wantage in securing an important debate like this. I want to start by expressing concern about the plight of owners of freehold homes who often face unreasonable charges and sharp practices at the hands of developers. The issue comes with so-called estate charges for maintenance of roads and common areas, often levied by the developer who built the estate in the first place. I feel that it's unfair that this type of homeowner can't challenge the reasonableness of these charges and have no access to dispute resolution or tribunals. So they don't enjoy equivalent rights to those which are granted to long leaseholders under current rules. I fear that this is allowing inappropriate practice to occur, and at least one of my constituents has told me of his anger and unhappiness at the high level of charges he's subjected to with no effective means to dispute or resist them. The government has indicated a willingness to legislate in this area to give freehold owners some similar rights to those which presently are enjoyed by leaseholders, but I think it is time that they got on with this. I would urge them to include some additional protections for freehold home owners in their forthcoming bill on leasehold reform. I, like others, want to strongly condemn the abusive practices that we've seen in relation to leaseholders. I very much support the work of the Competition and Markets Authority in investigating rip-off practices such as doubling ground rents every few years. As I said in the second reading debate on the ground rents bill, there is a case for allowing continued use of ground rents when, in relation to large complex apartment blocks, the complete exit of professional freeholders from the market, which is the expected consequence of abolition of ground rents, would leave leaseholders moving into such buildings with extensive financial and legal responsibilities. So I think it is worthwhile to consider, as the bill goes through, whether some leaseholders in some new blocks might want to have the option of leaving the stewardship of their block to a professional freeholder. But I want to turn now, Mr. Betts, to the planning system, which others have considered with great insight in the debate already today. I've put on record many times my concerns about the proposed reforms set out in the Planning for the Future White Paper. I very much welcome the indication by the Secretary of State that he's willing to think again about those plans, and I look forward to a clear public statement by the Secretary of State on what his views are on the Planning for the Future White Paper. I do not believe that the way to deliver the homes we need in this country is to strip people of their right to a say in what is built in their neighbourhood. There are a range of factors which slow down house building in this country which have nothing to do with the planning system. And I want to conclude my remarks by setting out just a few ideas on how we can ensure the right homes are built in the right quantities in the right places. And as a principle, I think any changes we do make to the planning system should increase, not undermine local democracy. They should strengthen and simplify the local planning processes to ensure that development is led by communities, not forced on them against their will. Nationally set housing targets should be advisory, not mandatory, and developers should not be able to use them to try and force local councils to agree to inappropriate development. Housing should sit within an integrated long-term development plan for urban regeneration to prioritise the levelling up commitments the government's made. Yes.
Thank the Honourable Lady. Just speaking many words of wisdom in relation to that. In my constituency of Strangford and across Northern Ireland, I suspect that the council rules are a wee bit more stringent, a bit more strict. For instance, if a developer wants to develop a number of houses, the commitment financially to roads structure, to infrastructure, to setting land aside for leisure, setting land aside for housing, for shops, setting land aside for education. That's all part of the integral planning regulations, and they change each phase it goes through. So does the Honourability agree that perhaps when it comes to looking at the changes, maybe the Minister should be looking towards Northern Ireland, as I know the Honourability has much knowledge of, for some opportunity to see how we can do it better?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for his point. I mean, I know there are certainly aspects of the Northern Ireland planning system that we could usefully learn from. It has its drawbacks as well, but I certainly feel strongly that developer contributions should be ring-fenced for the local communities who are directly affected by the new homes. Too often they end up, certainly in England, being distributed to a broader area, and those who bear the burden of the new development don't necessarily get the benefit of the developer contributions. Mr Betts, we should be using home building as a core part of efforts to regenerate northern and Midland cities and communities. Many of these have seen population declines over the past 50 years, and new housing and new infrastructure can help reverse that. We do also need to address land banking. We could, as the Honourable Member for Wantage has proposed, introduce a use it or lose it rule for land banked permissions. An agreed start-by date could be imposed and permission could be withdrawn if it's not met. Start-by should mean significant initial works, not digging a few holes or a trench. We could also impose end-by dates after which council tax should be payable on every home that's planned for, regardless of whether it's been built or not. There's a case for introducing a rule to limit the number of applications which can be made in relation to the same site. That would bring to an end the exasperating practice of developers coming back again and again and again with multiple applications being turned down, turning it into essentially a war of attrition with planners and local residents. I think there's also a strong case for a character test in planning so that those with a poor track record in development or with other reasons to doubt their ability to deliver could be blocked at the planning stage. And I believe that sites that have been illegally prepared for building, for example, where tree felling has taken place illegally, could be made ineligible for future planning applications. And I would certainly like to see the penalties increase for illegal tree felling by developers. Lastly, we could provide tax incentives for elderly homeowners to downsize, for example, by reducing stamp duty. So, Mr Chairman, as the Secretary of State contemplates which reforms to take forward and which to reject, I hope he will listen carefully to the concerns expressed in this debate. We must not let our rush for new homes compromise our environmental commitments, destroy our green or pleasant land, and we must not repeat the mistakes of the 60s and 70s when poor quality high-rise housing blighted the lives of millions of people. Thank you.
Right, just to emphasise now, no more than 6 minutes, please, otherwise other members will not get as much time. Kate Green.
Thank you very much, Mr Betts, and a happy New Year to you and all colleagues. And may I start by thanking the Honourable Member for Wantage for bringing forward this debate. In my constituency, we desperately need new homes for young families to buy and to rent. But I absolutely echo the comments that have been made by colleagues already this morning in terms of the way in which the dice are stacked against the home buyers and indeed the local authorities. I do recognise, Mr Betts, the progress that we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years with measures such as the New Homes Ombudsman and now the Building Safety Act going through Parliament. That will be of limited use, I have to say, in my constituency, where we have few buildings over 18 metres high. And even where we do have buildings over 18 metres high, we're still waiting for cladding in some cases to be removed and replaced as it should be. And may I also just take the opportunity, Mr Betts, to ask the Minister if he could update us on the situation in relation to assistance with the costs of replacing defective cladding in buildings under 18 metres high. This is an issue in my constituency, and along with all the other problems that we've heard leaseholders are experiencing, this is a very live issue. I particularly wanted to talk about some of the issues that home buyers in my constituency have experienced in relation to defects in their new homes, something that other honourable members have alluded to. I've spoken before in this House about Ora Court in Old Trafford and the risks faced by residents there from unsafe cladding staircases and walkways, which led to the Greater Manchester Fire Service placing a prohibition notice on the block. 2 years on, many of the issues that I last raised in this House are still unresolved, and meanwhile, a few yards away at another development in East Union Street, residents are still awaiting the completion of a sprinkler system, along with remediation of a number of other defects. Both of these developments were undertaken by the same developer, a Mr. Jason Alexander, through his network of companies. I've spoken about him before in this House too, Mr. Betts. He's notorious in the North West for substandard developments and failure to rectify defects once residents have moved in. Similar issues have been experienced at Renton Road in my constituency, where the developers are Mr. Seljuk Pinarbashi, whom I've also spoken about before. The homes in Renton Road have been now sold on, as my honourable friend, the member for Ellesmere Port mentioned, to private buyers. And the Council has therefore been advised that it needs to take enforcement action not against the developer, but against those homeowners, in fact against the very parties who have been aggrieved by the failures in the system. What it seems, Mr. Betts, to be the case is that developers can repeatedly take advantage of a planning and buildings control regime that creates conflicts of interest, gives precedence to the interests of builders and warranty companies over building quality and safety, and leaves leaseholders and, as my honourable friend, the member for Ellesmere Port has pointed out, often the local authority powerless to act. And that will continue even under the changes that we will see in the Building Safety Bill. There's no requirement in the bill mandating those undertaking building work to do so in accordance with plans that have either been submitted to and approved by a local authority or issued with a plan certificate by an approved inspector. The bill does provide for a power to make future regulations in this regard. I know that we haven't yet had a commitment from ministers to bring forward those regulations. May I urge the Minister to do so, given the widespread support that there was in response to the government's consultation for such a measure. Meanwhile, if a registered building control approver appointed by the developer wrongly approves, gives a plan certificate for, or issues an initial notice or a final certificate, the local authority is effectively locked out of enforcement action. I do recognise the bill creates new compliance and stop notices for local authorities in some circumstances, but they are hedged about with limitations. Just two other matters I'd like to mention, Mr. Betts. First of all, company law, which could be a useful tool in helping to act against unscrupulous developers and repeat offenders, but it repeatedly falls short. Mr. Alexander, for example, again and again will set up a new company for each development. Then he will either liquidate that company, strip it of assets, or allow it to be struck off for non-compliance with registration and other requirements, leaving the buyers with no body against which they can then pursue further action. It is pleasing to note inclusion in the Building Safety Bill of tougher provisions so that when an offence is committed by a corporate body with the connivance of a director, that director will commit an offence. But we do also need a more energetic approach to company law, and I would be very grateful if the Minister could support me in using his good offices to continue to press ministers in Bays, as I have been doing, for a less dilatory response from the company's registrar to enforcement action, and indeed to a toughening up of companies law, which I am aware ministers in Bays are considering, to ensure that those who breach the obligations that we would not rightly expect of directors cannot continue to behave in this way. And finally, may I say a very brief word about managing agents, and I very much echo the comments that have been made today. Residents of Eden Square in Urmston have been battling their management company, RMG, for years for essential work to be undertaken at what repeatedly looks like excessive costs when anything is actually done, and they're not alone. The Minister may have seen the report in the Sunday Times on the 5th of December in relation to the mismanagement and greed displayed by this organisation. And meanwhile, Mr. Jason Alexander retains control of the management company at East Union Street and is trying to regain control of the management company at Ora Court, despite his long track record of failure to act. So, Mr. Betts, in conclusion, I support very much the concerns that have been raised about the weakness of the regulatory regime in relation to developers and in relation to management agents. And I very much hope that the Minister will want to work with colleagues in this House and in this debate this morning to look at how we can continue to enhance and improve protections for homeowners.
Natalie Elphick.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to speak on this important topic, which is very close to my heart. As such, I draw attention to my register of interests. In Dover and Deal, like so many other constituencies, there have been some good developments and some downright awful developments. This needs to change. There needs to be an end to shoddy homes and poor customer service when buying a new home. Before I became an MP, I was asked, as an independent expert in this area, to lead the practical work, to design, develop and then implement major new reforms to provide those better standards and improved consumer redress for new homes. These consist of a new quasi-regulator, the New Homes Quality Board, which I chair as set out in my register of interests. It is a wholly independent, not-for-profit body. By its own constitution, builders and warranty providers taken together can never form a majority on it. It is supported with consumer representation provided from citizens' advice on the board itself and with an active consumer engagement panel structured into its core design. The New Homes Quality Board holds a register of developers. There is a New Homes Ombudsman to provide that consumer redress free to consumers. A new code to set out much-needed standards and principles for developers, as we have heard today. Indeed, the new code, which has taken nearly 5 years to develop, is so extensive and far-reaching that one major developer has said that their change management programme exceeds 40,000 changes to their business. A full public consultation was carried out on the code, and I hope that it will go some way to meet some of the concerns that have been expressed today by a number of honourable and right honourable members. But there are appalling situations, and it may not surprise my honourable friend for Wantage from his own experience that from the consultation, only 4% of new home buyers said that they thought developers met all of the fundamental principles set out in this new code. Only 4%. So 96% of industry clearly have more to do. This is such important work, I have been determined to see it through to its final operational launch in the coming weeks, before I will step back and hand over to my successor. This is, and has always been, work which is cross-party and indeed cross-governmental. It works with administrations right across the UK, in England, Scotland, Wales and in Northern Ireland. It started from some vital leadership by the APPG on the built environment. I'm delighted for my honourable friend the Minister that he is here today and shepherding in those far-reaching reforms through the Building Safety Bill and other measures. As he was the chair of the APPG, which set out the problems and solutions for this area of new homes, including the need for a New Homes Ombudsman. As well as Mr Betts, your very, very vital work under the leadership of the Housing and Communities Select Committee over many years. So turning to some other detailed points in the time available, which I'd like to just draw to my honourable friend and other members and right honourable members' attention. On making sure that the house is right first time, that it is complete. The code specifies that a home must now be complete. It prevents customers from being paid to move into an incomplete and shoddy home. It may sound absurd, yet that was what was happening, that people were paid to move into a home. For example, perhaps one bathroom was working in a house of 2 bathrooms and 4 bedrooms. Perhaps even plumbing wasn't finished, let alone other things. And the homeowner would have the job of their life trying to get things fixed after they had moved in and the builder had moved out. Turning to environmental and building safety standards, it is a requirement of the new code to meet all building safety, environmental and similar regulations. My honourable friend and my right honourable friend are quite right that building green homes and warm homes is central to building good homes. I'm sure the Minister has heard in relation to environmental standards in the context of the upcoming planning reform, and I hope he will also consider the importance of water sustainability in considering wider community architecture of cities, towns and villages to reduce and prevent flooding and promote better and sustainable water usage. The new building safety regulator being established is absolutely essential because some of the safety situations for new homes have been shocking. No more than the situation faced by my constituents in Sholden, where fire breaks were supposed to be in place, but they were not. Some of my constituents are still waiting to receive safety certificates, which they need to sell their homes, as well as giving them peace of mind in their home every day. Finally, the new code requires builders to have an effective and standardised aftercare service. There will be fixed timeframes, as my honourable friend has recommended. And the backstop to all of this is an independent New Homes Ombudsman service. Following a competitive, open procurement process over many months, the Dispute Service has been chosen as the preferred New Homes Ombudsman partner, and they have an impressive record across the 4 nations of the UK. All the arrangements will be paid for by the house building industry, and access to the New Homes Ombudsman will be free to consumers, and I hope this will begin to make a significant difference as we move forward. Mr. Betts, in the time available, I hope I've given a flavour of the significant changes underway. These are necessary changes, and if they don't go far enough, my honourable friend will find me on the continuing journey with him in this place to press for further change. Change that is urgently needed, for a home is where the heart is, and a person's home is their castle. Thank you.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Betts. A real pleasure to serve under you, and a Happy New Year to yourself and to all in the Chamber. Can I congratulate the member for Wantage as well for securing this debate. What is most telling, perhaps, about the debate and its title is the absence of reference to local authorities, to councils. And I understand that the focus is very much aimed at developers and house builders and so on. But when you look at the changes to the Department for Housing, Community and Local Government, of course, it now no longer includes local government in its description. It's concerning, really, about the future of what will happen in the provision of housing. We need to look at this sector in the round, as so many have said so far in the debate. But what seems clear is that for many years there's been a too cosy a relationship between developers and some certain preferred management companies, and likewise certain builders. For me, it is the role of locally elected representatives and the voice of communities that really matters in the delivery of housing. What is required in the area? And good local authorities can absolutely do that. We saw through the pandemic how it was local authorities who actually delivered and helped us through the challenges of that. We have good planners in our local authorities. With proper consultation, they can build the right mix of housing that meets the needs of the local people, not the needs of developers. And where we need truly affordable housing, the social housing that this country needs, for young people who are so often priced out of their communities, whether they be in villages, towns or neighbourhoods, but also the provision for seniors, people that may no longer need several bedrooms, who want and need to downsize, and for whom retaining independence is critical to their mental health and well-being, and for whom access to town centres and communal spaces is vital, but how so often they are left remote from the communities they have lived in their entire lives, denied the access to transport networks or the short walks into their centres. Too much has been left to the enterprise of the market, which has been shown not to work in the interests of people. Government perhaps too giddy on the donations of developer donors to act and do what is right. Predated by a coalition government that so diluted building regulations and planning legislation that it delivered a developer's charter. I'm afraid, Mr. Betts, resulting in low-density housing developments, unsustainable housing with poor energy performance and greater car dependency. In my constituency, there are estates with no community centres, shopping areas, although they have been promised. The councils need greater power, as I've said. Rather than emasculating councils, the government needs to empower them, as many, I think, have said across this chamber. Give them the tools, give them the authority to deliver what is absolutely needed in their localities. And what is striking is the number of applications approved by councils which remain unbuilt. The Local Government Association, the LGA, have quoted, and it's been mentioned, 1.1 million homes yet to be built out. But there's a further 1 million that developers are yet to seek planning permission for. So 2 million homes that could be built. We heard about the role of developers, about land banking, about not building out. I mean, we look at the Letwin review of some years ago and where that led. I mean, there was some decent findings in that, but it was inconclusive, and I think it could have been much harder hitting, and I did discuss that with him when he was still in this place. And the viability, the issue of the National Planning Policy Framework and the Localism Act, and what led to this question of viability. The viability is all premised on the cost of land, and giving greater authority and power to local government would actually address that and change the dynamic between developers and builders and authorities. Builders, as I say, sometimes are linked to or tied to developers. There are good and there are bad. But of course, you have subcontractors in the mix. So when we talk about the quality of house building, it is often not necessarily the builders themselves, but the subbies that come in and do the work. And then it comes down to the legality and the contractual responsibility for any subsequent claim. As we've heard about management companies, what purpose? You're locked into high annual fees. People are being bullied and exploited, and so many, as we've heard, and it's certainly true in my constituency of Warwick and Leamington, residents who just don't want to be named. They do not want to have this in the public arena about the estate they live on, for fear of the impact on property values. And of course, the developers and builders know that as well. These estate management companies, as we've heard so much already, exploiting residents. With the green space fees, the management fees for that developers are claiming to residents that they'll get a discount on their council tax because of that fee that they're paying. It's complete nonsense that they're being promised. But also streets where certain homes, refuse lorries will not travel because they are not able to. What we need to see, Mr. Betts, is actual housing need, questionable algorithms that we've heard from the government over recent months. We actually need to deliver the power to the local authorities, localised and regionalised planning to help deliver that, the infrastructure that goes with it, transport, schools, GP provision, even shops need to be put in. The environmental standards. I mean, thousands of homes have been built in Warwick and Leamington, some with solar panels on north-facing roofs, believe it or not. We've got the future home standards, but it lacks ambition. In 2016, we would have zero carbon homes. We would have built 1 million homes to that standard by now, if that had been allowed. And then we need greater consumer protections. Finally, Mr. Betts, if I may, housing is too expensive in this country. It's so much down to the cost of land. It's a huge economic cost, which is having huge impact on our wider economy. We need to bring down the cost of housing.
Mark Francois.
Thank you, Mr. Betts, and a very happy new year to you. As we've limited time today, I want essentially to make 3 points in my contribution. First, having served as an MP for over 20 years, the whole issue of housing development and association infrastructure still remains the most controversial issue within my Raleigh and Wickford constituency. One of the things I've learned from that is that in order to be accepted by local people, development is something that has to be done with people rather than to people. But the major house builders rarely seem to understand that. The legislative framework within which the house building industry has to operate is obviously fundamental. In that regard, we are still awaiting the publication of the government's much-delayed planning bill. This has led to an iniquitous situation whereby the Department for Levelling Up continues to harry local authorities to finalise their local plans, despite holding back legislation which, once enacted, might mean that local councils have to revise or even substantially rewrite the plans they have just, in many cases, literally spent years working upon. This is becoming a bit like waiting for Godot, or to put it another way, the department has to remove the plank from their own eye on this. So I humbly ask the Minister today, when can we expect the actual publication of the planning bill, and when is the second reading debate now likely to be? Secondly, the UK housing market is now effectively an example of near-market failure. It's completely dominated by half a dozen or so major house builders, some of whom have grown by absorbing competitors down the years, and which now restricts choice and, even more importantly, artificially restricts housing supply, deliberately in order to keep prices up. Liam Halligan, the economics editor of the Sunday Telegraph, and now a popular TV presenter, explored this problem in great detail in his very good 2019 book, Home Truths, the UK's Chronic Housing Shortage, in which he exposes the adverse effects of the dominance of the volume house builders on the housing market. For instance, Mr Betts, as Liam Halligan points out, since the Office of Fair Trading's investigation into the housing sector in 2008, the market share of the volume house builders has almost doubled, from 31% to 59%, not far off two-thirds of the entire market. And of course, COVID, by increasing the pressure on smaller builders, many with limited financial reserves, is only likely to have made that serious market anomaly worse. As Liam Halligan argues, I quote, "An oligopolistic housing sector deliberately restricting the supply of new homes to keep profits high is anathema to free markets." But it's even worse than that. The paradigm the government appears to be working in is one of house building being held back by NIMBY local authorities, despite the best efforts of house builders to build new homes. In fact, the reverse is true. As the Local Government Association pointed out in February 2020, there are over 1 million excellent planning permissions for new properties, but these have not yet been built out. Moreover, in October of that year, the Campaign for the Protection of Rural England produced a report which highlighted that over 500,000 of these plots alone are on existing brownfield sites. Perhaps a previous chief executive of Persimmon Homes, who stood down after his £75 million bonus, was so profane that it embarrassed not just his own company but the rest of the industry as well, was untroubled by these facts. Nevertheless, some of the practices we have already heard about from other colleagues this morning still go on. So where, one has to ask, are ministers? And indeed, where is the Competition and Markets Authority in all of this? My third point is a very practical example of how truly arrogant some of these companies have now become. Bloor Homes, one of the largest privately owned developers in Britain, was so desperate to secure planning permission for a highly controversial site off the Ashenden Road in my constituency, they even resorted to trying to interfere with the composition of the Development Control Committee of Rochford District Council that was due to consider the application last June. Having subsequently lost, the committee turned them down, Bloor's political consultant then sent a series of highly intemperate, even offensive texts late at night to the leader of the council. It's the sheer arrogance of these tactics, something which I had not previously encountered in over 30 years of public life as a councillor myself and then as an MP, that I find deeply shocking. This is now the sad reality of house building in Britain today. We've got limited time, Mr Betts, so I won't try and read all of these communications into the record, but nonetheless I hope perhaps in the second reading debate on the planning bill I'll have an opportunity to do that, so that ministers, other parliamentary colleagues, the media and indeed other people in the house building industry know how Bloor Homes really behave. In summary, Mr Betts, the UK house building sector is now deeply troubled, bordering on dysfunction. Many ordinary families are struggling to buy their own home, while some of the major house builders ruthlessly exploit their agony to maintain their already generous profit margins. They blame everyone but themselves: government, MPs, local authorities, concerned local residents, anyone but the greedy companies who are now at the heart of the entire problem. If ministers really want to boost housing supply, let us have a full inquiry by the Competition and Markets Authority into over-concentration in the UK house building industry, and let's have it now. Thank you, Mr Betts.
As I want to start the front bench at 10:38, please, 5 minutes each for the last two speakers. Holly Lynch.
Thank you so much, Mr Betts. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship this morning. And can I thank the Honourable Member for having secured this debate and his very powerful opening contribution. Any plan for house building for the future must absolutely come with an assessment of where the system is currently failing. And as has been demonstrated by all the contributions so far, issues with new and more recently built homes are becoming increasingly significant in MPs' caseloads. Issues with properties not completed to the promised standard and poor maintenance are a real source of cost and frustration for so many people, with poor communication and barriers to these issues being fixed, often further exacerbating the problem. One such example is Greenside Gardens in Sawborough Bridge in my constituency. The original developer of the site went bankrupt before the properties were finished, and the site was subsequently then bought by another developer. The second developer was able to complete the vast majority of the development, but the access road to the site was still left in an appalling state. Materials had simply been abandoned, and residents had to take it upon themselves to clear the site, having to hire skips to clear much of the rubbish, taking several weeks to complete. Having spoken to the council on residents' behalf, they informed me that they could not take any action against the developer in relation to the road, as they were advised that they could not compel the developer to complete the road to the required standard for adoption, nor did they have the appropriate funds available to carry out the works as the Highways Authority. It's clear from this instance that there is a serious lack of accountability and transparency in this process. The way our system is currently designed does not effectively allow residents to raise concerns and seek the appropriate redress if required. The New Homes Ombudsman is certainly a welcome step, but we are still awaiting the details of when it will come into force. And so I'd appreciate if the Minister could confirm that the Ombudsman will allow for historic complaints to be determined, so my constituents are able to receive any compensation or redress that they should be entitled to. Another example from my constituency that I wish to highlight is in relation to Harron Homes and the Most Idley development in North Arran. The properties built were not cheap, usually 4 or 5 bedroom homes. I've been contacted by 7 residents who have all raised issues of homes being finished to a poor standard and countless snagging issues, many of which still are not resolved or fixed years after completion. It's completely unacceptable, not least as these houses were advertised and sold as luxury homes. One of my constituents who's been deeply affected by this is Dr Rani Khatib, who has worked as an NHS doctor on the front line throughout the pandemic. Due to the issues with his property, he's been forced to take multiple days off for contractors to attend his home, only for them to not show up. In one of his emails, he said, "When the world is uniting to help frontline NHS workers to deal with COVID-19, on my shift I'm having to worry about constantly chasing Harron Homes about the safety of my children due to the rubbish they left in my garage, the outstanding work they never completed, and the many issues they have still not addressed." Now, we've managed to have 2 meetings with Harron Homes, Mr Betts, and so progress has been made, but there seems to be what only can be described as churn in staff. So when someone moves on, letters, calls and emails from both myself and constituents have gone unanswered for months at a time, and I've had to resort to asking to meet the Managing Director to attempt to resolve the multiple cases my office are trying to manage. So whilst there has been some progress more recently from Harron Homes, it's been a fraught journey and one, I'm afraid to say, is far from over. In conclusion, we know that good quality affordable housing has to be a focus if we are to meet this country's needs. But unless we introduce true accountability into house building expectations with consequences for not having met those expectations, then we only stand to compound the problems. As demonstrated by the local examples at Most Idley and Greenside Gardens that I have shared, it should be the role of the developer and house builder to fix repairs and ensure properties are habitable and safe as an absolute minimum. As things stand, the system is unfair, unjust and deeply biased towards those who can afford advice and representation. A New Homes Ombudsman should be introduced as an independent, empowered body to hold developers and house builders accountable. Enough of the delays. It is time for the government to deliver on what it has promised, as for far too many, the dream of owning a new home has far too quickly become a nightmare.
Robbie Moore.
Thank you, and it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mr Betts. May I wish all members a happy new year, and may I thank my honourable friend, the member for Wantage, for securing this important debate. And this debate is important because it allows us not just to discuss the role house builders play before the houses are built, but also making sure that homes are fit for purpose once they are finished. Buying a home is probably the most important purchase, probably the most expensive purchase that any of us will make. And with this in mind, I wish to raise the case of a specific development within my constituency, the High Banks development in Silsden, which has sadly witnessed mismanagement by its construction company Harron Homes. And it's perfect timing, Mr Betts, that I'm following on from the member for Halifax, who has spent most of her speech talking about Harron Homes, and I intend to do the same. This is a development which was constructed and finished back in 2020, and it consists of about 50 properties. And I have been contacted, and indeed the local councillor, Councillor Rebecca Whittaker, who represents the Craven district, has also been contacted by about 30 of the 50 residents, because the manner in which this development has been finished, the snagging issues, are quite frankly shocking. And I have visited this site many times myself, and as soon as I arrived it became quite clear why residents have contacted me and Councillor Rebecca Whittaker. The road is in a shocking state. Sewerage is still not yet, sewage supply is still not connected to the main sewage system, and the development is having a tanker coming in on a weekly basis to empty the tanks. Many house owners have contacted me about walls and cracks within their walls appearing, plumbing systems within their houses not being connected or finished off, floorboards creaking, the gardens not being properly landscaped or finished off, boundary fences not being finished. And, Mr Betts, this situation is not satisfactory at all. One constituent told me that they had waited that long for many of these issues to be sorted, that they got on and carried them out themselves, for the developer to then come back and say, well, you finished it, we're not coming in to sort it out. This is just not good enough. I know that High Banks is not the only Harron Homes development to face these issues. The member for Halifax has already raised her case, but I know that similar issues in Dewsbury and the Colne Valley have also expressed the same. Communication is a big concern with this particular developer. I tried, on the back of raising these constituents coming to me, to have a meeting with the managing director. I requested this meeting in summer of last year. We've only been able to manage to secure a meeting on site with him in October. And they have promised to keep many of the constituents communicated. Indeed, they promised to give me a 6-weekly update on the back of having a meeting with Tony Lee, who is the managing director of Harron Homes, and Andy Hall, the construction director, and I have not received any update since having the meeting with them in October. Indeed, the residents have only received one piece of communication. This, again, is not good enough, and as a result, I continue to receive correspondence from constituents of High Banks saying Harron Homes are doing absolutely nothing since I have met them, or indeed since 2020 when they finished the development, to improve the site. The company have not kept their promises to those who have bought their home, and I have again raised the case, well, where do we go from here? So I am calling on Harron Homes again to respect their contractual relationship with their purchasers and not blame it on subcontractors who they have instructed beyond this case that they are not doing the case. The responsibility solely relies with the developer, Harron Homes. These have got to be, the snagging issues have got to be completed within a respectful time frame, and not with an excuse that the pandemic, which I have had from Harron Homes, has been used as an excuse for these snagging issues not being dealt with in an appropriate time frame. There's also got to be an auditing process in place. It surely has got to be the responsibility of it, when a developer hands over a completed house to a purchaser, that they have a responsibility to go back to the purchaser and say, has the home been completed to a standard that you were expecting? And that surely, that process has got to be done 6 months and then potentially a year after that. Harron Homes has done none of that. And I would like to, as the member for Wantage said, see much tougher regime for dealing with the quality of house building, with a fixed term timeframes being implemented and with penalties possibly taking place if homes are not completed. Thank you very much.
Members for keeping to time limits. That's appreciated. Move over to the front benches now. 10 minutes for each of the two front benches, and then short time for the mover to wind up at the end. Matthew Bennigal.
Thank you, Mr Betts. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair. And can I start by also wishing all members and staff present a Happy New Year, and adding my congratulations to the Honourable Member for Wantage on securing this important debate, and for the comprehensive and extremely well-judged, I thought, introductory remarks he made. It has been Mr Betts, as expected given the subject, a wide-ranging debate with a series of thoughtful contributions informed by the experiences of honourable members on all sides with new build development in their respective constituencies. And I'd like to highlight in particular the contributions made by my honourable friends, the members for Ellesmere Port and Neston and Warwick and Leamington, who spoke to the importance of local authorities in housing and planning, the imbalance of power between councils and developers, and the constraints the latter therefore face when it comes to meeting the needs of their populations. The contributions of my honourable friends for Stretford-Nurmston and Halifax, who spoke very powerfully with cases of unscrupulous developers from their own constituencies, as the honourable gentleman who's just spoke did so in reference to Harron Homes, and the lack of accountability that there is in terms of the current system at least, for redress for the serious defects they face. In the time I have available to me, Mr Betts, I'd like to expand on three issues that have featured in the debate this morning and that the honourable member for Wantage touched upon in his introductory remarks. First, what is the quality of new homes being built? Second, as well as building new homes, do we have a system that supports the creation of sustainable communities where individuals and families can not just live but thrive? And third, are buyers of new build homes getting a fair deal? Turning first to quality, it manifestly remains the case, despite the problem being both long-standing and widely understood, that a significant proportion of those buying recent new builds in England find that, having moved into their new home, that their properties have serious defects. And it has been made clear today in cases from across the country, to which I could add a great many from my own constituency, Mr Betts. We're not talking here about minor snagging issues, but major defects, whether that be in relation to the fabric of the building, unfinished fittings or faults with utilities. The fundamental reason that standards remain too low is simple. The housing market is broken and the planning system is in crisis. As the right honourable member, the right honourable gentleman, the member for Raleigh and Wickford argued, the housing market doesn't have a sufficient diversity of supply, and it's not one in which, aside from a minority at homes at the very top end of the market, quality of product is rewarded by price. And a decade of planning deregulation has exacerbated that situation, with a relaxation of permitted development being the most egregious example of decisions taken by this Conservative government that will increase the amount of substandard housing being delivered across the country, with all the negative impacts that has for health and life chances that flow from it. For all the rhetoric around beauty and the various initiatives announced in the wake of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, the present system still overwhelmingly produces, as extensive analysis by the Place Alliance has shown, mediocre or poor outcomes when it comes to build quality and design. We, of course, must robustly challenge developers and house builders to improve their performance and call out those choosing not to build better quality housing or using the planning appeals process to force through schemes with the lowest design quality. But there is much more the government could do to drive up standards. The establishment of the New Homes Ombudsman is, of course, welcome, although the Minister will know the concerns that we on this side have about its membership. Likewise, we welcome the publication of the New Homes Quality Code. But given its nature and the fact that it relies on compliance with national standards that presently, I'd argue, fall far short, we have little confidence it will lead to the needed step change in developer behaviour. The fact is, Mr Betts, until the government acts to ensure we have a planning system fit for purpose and makes greater progress on diversifying the housing industry and delivering a marked increase in output, including in terms of genuinely affordable homes, the numbers seeking redress for serious defects are unlikely to fall significantly. Turning next to the issue of how we ensure that the construction of new homes creates sustainable and thriving communities. As things stand, far too many new build developments are not being delivered with the necessary key amenities and social and physical infrastructure to provide for such communities. And we've heard, again, a great many examples this morning. That's because the present housing and planning framework is simply not conducive to effective placemaking. That's not a new phenomenon, of course. Indeed, it's been remarked upon as far back as the 2007 Calcutt Review. But the problem has become more acute in recent years as a direct result of this government's commitment to deregulating the planning system, with a relaxation of permitted development rights, in particular preventing councils, the skills, morale and capacity of whose planning departments are at an all-time low after a decade of budget cuts, from coordinating development or planning vital infrastructure and services. And it's a situation that's having a direct impact on the provision of environmentally sustainable development. For example, in terms of the relationship between relatively inaccessible development sites and rates of sustainable transport use, or buildings that are constructed on sites without due regard to climate resilience. Again, the fundamental problem is a development model geared primarily towards the wants of developers rather than one whose primary purpose is securing what is in the public interest. When it comes to enabling effective placemaking, the government must, as a minimum, rescind the damaging relaxation of permitted development rights and return those powers to local government. Ministers should then turn their attention to what more the government must do to encourage the creation of thriving communities that support the health and well-being of their residents, not least by implementing comprehensive national housing standards so that developers, particularly the volume house builders, have no choice but to deliver when it comes to core placemaking. Lastly, Mr Betts, turning to the issue of whether those buying new homes are getting a fair deal. The answer in far too many cases is clearly no, particularly for leaseholders. That's most obvious in relation to the topical issue of ground rents for new leasehold homes. The House will know that we on this side welcome the Leasehold Reform Ground Rent Bill, but we remain of the view that the issue of onerous ground rents must be tackled in relation to existing long residential leases, not just new homes, and we urge the Government once again to reconsider its position on that matter. With regard to existing long residential leases, we obviously welcome the commitment given by Taylor Wimpey to the CMA to remove onerous ground rent terms from its existing contracts. The imposition of those terms was wholly unjustified, and it's obviously right that the relevant clauses will be removed. Other developers and freehold investors must now also do the right thing and abandon escalation clauses in their leasehold contracts. And when he responds, I'd welcome the Minister making clear for the record that that is what the Government now expects them to do. But the issue of ground rents, Mr Bett, is not the only way in which those buying new leasehold homes are getting a bad deal. There are a range of issues, from soaring service charges to the unregulated nature of managing agents, that all point to the need not only for measures to address specific problems, but wider leasehold reform and reform of the current framework for resident control of estate management, issues that I have no doubt that Ministers and I will return to on many future occasions. Specifically on protecting the owners of new homes from abuse and poor service at the hands of disreputable management companies, could I ask the Minister to tell the House whether the Government intends to implement the recommendations of the Regulation of Property Agents Working Group chaired by the Noble Lord, Lord Best, and what progress has been made in that regard, given that the final report was published back in July 2019. To conclude, Mr Betts, I think this has been a valuable debate and a welcome opportunity to hear the concerns of honourable members from across the House with regard to new homes. But it is taking place almost 12 years after 12 years of Conservative-led government and numerous changes to housing and planning legislation in that time. And yet, when it comes to new homes, outcomes for people and communities on the whole have not only not improved, but in a number of key areas have noticeably deteriorated. It's self-evident that more needs to be done to drive up quality and design standards across the industry, to enable and support more effective placemaking, and to ensure that those buying new homes get a fair deal. I look forward to hearing from the Minister, not least in relation to the planning legislation. We're told the Government remain committed to introducing what the Government are going to do differently to ensure real progress is made on these objectives.
Call the Minister now, and if the Minister could just allow a brief period at the end for the mover to wind up, that would be appreciated.
Thank you, Mr Betts. Pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and congratulations to the Honourable Member for Wantage for securing this debate. I think we can see from the contributions that have been made, this is a topic that promotes passion, shall we say, not just on behalf of the members and right honourable members who have contributed, but also on the part of their constituents. I welcome the Honourable Member for Greenwich and Woolwich to his place, wish him a happy new year, but not too successful a new year, obviously. And with regard to future planned legislation, particularly with regard to leasehold reform, I look forward to discussing with him and other members to ensure that we get that legislation in a good place before it's brought forward. Now, I understand how important it is that infrastructure comes with new housing. Indeed, The Honourable Member for Wantage is a one-man campaign machine when it comes to working to ensure that he secures infrastructure for his constituents when it comes with housing. As he says, they're not NIMBYs, they just understand that it's not just houses, it's the infrastructure they require. Now, Section 106 agreements of around £1 billion were agreed towards infrastructure in 2018-19. These include contributions to transport, open spaces, the environment, education and medical facilities. Community Infrastructure Levy also allows local authorities to obtain the funds needed to deliver infrastructure such as roads, schools, health facilities and flood defences. Currently, around 50% of local authority charge CIL, which is estimated that the liability for new planning permissions amounting to roughly £1 billion from 2018-19. Now, the Housing Infrastructure Fund also provides £4.3 billion to put improved transport connectivity, healthcare services and other infrastructure in place before housing is built. We already made changes to reduce the renegotiation of affordable housing and infrastructure commitments made through Section 106 agreements. To reduce the renegotiation, the Government requires local authorities to have clear policy requirements in their local plans. This means that landholders and site purchasers are aware of likely costs up front and can take this into consideration when agreeing land transactions. The Government has also set out clear guidance on how viability assessments should be undertaken and made public to ensure that there is consistency and transparency in this approach. However, the Government recognises that the existing system of developer contributions can sometimes be costly and complex, which can delay developments and reduce certainty for communities. That is why we're exploring the introduction of a new infrastructure levy to replace the current system of developer contributions. This levy will seek to deliver at least as much value and on-site affordable housing as at present. We're proposing to make the levy non-negotiable as a charge on a fixed proportion of the development value to reduce the renegotiation issues that Section 106 agreements are prone to. So our intention is that the proceeds from the levy will be collected and spent locally and would provide flexibility for councils with regard to how they are spent. Now, on planning reforms, unfortunately I have not much to add at the moment. Our Secretary of State took control of the department, the newly empowered department, in September, and clearly has an awful lot of things in his in-tray that he is working through. But the Secretary of State is committed to both looking at planning reform while also fulfilling the Government's levelling up ambitions, carefully considering what reforms are needed to the system and how best to take those forward. An announcement will be made in due course. On that point, I will of course give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Disappointingly, if he can't give us any timings on the planning bill, because some of us would like to know when it's coming before we retire, he's had 10 very good backbench contributions this morning. It's been a very good debate, Mr Betts. All of them, one way or another, highly critical of the house building industry in this country. When will the Government support a competition and markets inquiry into the UK house building industry, please?
Well, as set out, the Government is already working very closely with the CMA in order to push forward their ambitions, and clearly there's some court cases going on at the moment, so it would probably be inappropriate to comment, except to say we are enthusiastic to support. And I'd just like to put on record the Secretary of State did read the Honourable Gentleman's book over Christmas, and I think has got in touch with him to say how good a read it was.
I was told I couldn't plug it in the debate.
Just very briefly then, I'm going to run out of time. So with regard to net zero, clearly a number of people have highlighted the point that we need to ensure that we're building homes that are as environmentally sound and low carbon in their production as possible. And people have concerned about the transition to the new legislation. Now, we introduced a Part L uplift, Building Regulations Part L, in order to improve the energy efficiency of homes just before Christmas. Now, in order for a developer to make use of the transitional arrangements that exist, they must have submitted an initial notice, a building notice or full planning application to the local authority prior to the new regulations coming into effect in June 2022. They must then have commenced work on an individual building they want to apply the previous standards to before June 2023. Now, members referred to the idea of digging a trench in order to have started work on site, but we are going to be more stringent with the application of this, and it would be things like having started the foundations for the actual building in order for the previous regs to apply. So those transitional arrangements mean that developers can no longer build out-of-date energy standards over several years as sites are developed. Unless the construction of building has actually commenced, they will need to build to current regulations. And a full technical consultation with regard to the future home standard is planned for spring 2023, and as part of this we'll consider what transitional arrangements are appropriate for that legislation. Now, several members have mentioned management companies and their bad practice in many cases. Put simply, the current situation is unfair to freeholders, and we are committed to introducing legislation to right this wrong. We intend to create a new statutory regime for freeholders based on the rights enjoyed by leaseholders. This would ensure that maintenance charges must be reasonably incurred, and the services provided are of an acceptable standard and include a right to challenge the reasonableness of the charges at a property tribunal. Our ambition is for freeholders to have a right to change the provider of maintenance services by applying to the tribunal to appoint a new manager. This may be especially helpful for freeholders dissatisfied with the services they are currently receiving. Government intends to bring forward legislation to implement those changes as soon as parliamentary time allows. And the build-out rate has also been raised. The government is clear that new homes should be built out as soon as possible once planning permission is granted. Sir Oliver Letwin's independent review of build-out rates found no evidence that speculative land banking is part of the business model of major house builders, nor that it's a driver of slow build-out rates. Nonetheless, noting that build-out is important to communities, we're exploring further options, and in our Planning for the Future white paper that was referenced earlier, we've been clear that we will be exploring those further options to support faster build-out rates as part of our proposed planning reform. I just wanted to say, with regard to the honourable members for Keighley and Halifax and the concern that they raised about Harran Homes, I would be very happy to meet with them to discuss the concerns that they've got and see if there's anything that we can advise. Obviously, we can't intervene in particular cases, but there might be some advice that we can give. And with regard to the Building Safety Bill, again, the Secretary of State is working very closely with Lord Greenhalgh in order to see what else can be done, and I would hope that an announcement will be made in the not-too-distant future. So, in conclusion, Mr Betts, I just wanted to say, excellent debate, very grateful for the opportunity to contribute and respond to it, and I look forward to bumping into members around the corridor to discuss some of the issues that they have raised during the course of the debate.
David Johnson.
Thank you very much, Mr Betts, and can I thank the Shadow Minister and Minister for their comments. I think there's a lot of agreement there beyond the natural party political arguments. A constituent said to me that buying a new home had been a terrible experience and one they wouldn't repeat. And that is an indictment of how the current system operates. I think the members for Halifax and for Keighley gave powerful examples of the impact it has on constituents and on their mental health, because this is in their minds at all times. I think the members for Ellesmere Port and Neston and Warwick and Leamington were quite right about the system working in the interests of developers, not local people. And as the member for Ellesmere Port said, what is the incentive to come back and fix it? At the moment, there isn't one with these problems. Members for Chipping, Barton and Stretford and Emerson, I thought they had very interesting ideas about how we might use companies' law and character tests, because actually we all know who the bad companies and individuals are in this area. We shouldn't keep letting them build more and more homes. The member for Rayleigh and Wickford was bang on about near market failure. I've read some of Liam Halligan's work. That 1 million plus permissions that are existed and not built on, I think he found just 3 companies own 90% of them. If that's not an example of near-market failure, I'm not sure what is. The member for Dover Deal was very encouraging about the new code that's forthcoming, but it's pretty clear the scale of the problem if only 4% of homeowners think their developers are meeting the aspects of that code, and one business is changing 40,000 aspects of its practices in order to meet it. One of my local housing association CEOs said to me, they're building something to walk away from, and we're buying something we need to maintain for people to live in for 50 to 100 years. And that's at the core of this problem. I know the minister's worked on this area before he became the minister and is very committed to it. I hope we'll see the full weight of government behind this, because home should be a sanctuary, not a place of great stress, and it's something I continue to keep campaigning on, and I know that other members will too. With that, Mr. Betts, thank you very much for sharing.